I don't know about you, but on several occasions, I've had the question come up, where did all the religions come from? And what's also interesting is people's opinions in the matter of various religions of the world. You've probably heard someone say, well, basically, all religions eventually lead to the same place, don't they? And while this statement sounds magnanimous and might sound plausible to some, there's a better approach to find the answer to both those questions. There is, in fact, a historical tracing to the origins of many beliefs. And this is why we are looking at the topic of the religions of Babel today on Truth Matters. Today, truth is denied, ignored, and resisted with open hostility. Yet in life and in times of crisis, we discover that truth matters. As I mentioned in the introduction, you've probably heard the analogy of many roads leading to the same God or heaven. It's sometimes been portrayed as a mountain with many trails that all end up in the same place at the top. And while this analogy allows everyone the freedom of choice as well as to practically design their own way, it really fails when applied to the factual world. And as some have said, well, all religions are fundamentally the same. They only vary in details. And yet, a cursory study of the content of various religions points out the opposite. They are, in fact, fundamentally different, and they only share some details. Perhaps a better example than the illustration of the mountain mentioned earlier would be a train station. All trains began at a single location, but when they leave, they take different tracks and they arrive at different destinations. This is why, in order to get an accurate answer to the origins of various religions, we need to go back to the origination of things. This is what brings us to Genesis. Let's recount in short manner what we've seen already in the first chapters of Genesis. Genesis 1 covers the creation of everything. Genesis 2 and 3, we have the account of the creation of mankind and his fall. Genesis 4 and 5 records the first homicide and then the record of Adam's descendants. Genesis 6 tells us of the corruption of mankind as his numbers grow. Genesis 7 through 9 is the record of the flood and the covenant that God makes with Noah. Genesis 10 records the descendants of Noah, and this brings us to Genesis 11. If you haven't noticed, these first 11 chapters of Genesis provides us of what is called the origins of information in the Bible. In these chapters, we are told of the origin of the created world. We're told about the origin of sin and evil in the world. We have the first homicide. We're told of the first worldwide judgment and a hint of the eventual judgment of the world. We're also informed that all of us are descendants from one family. We all came off the same boat. And then in Genesis 11, we're told where all the languages of the world came from. And it is in this narrative that we will also find direction as to the question of the various religions of the world. Now, to do this, we begin by looking at what occurs in the narrative of Genesis 11. In verse 1, it says, now all the earth used the same language and the same words. Now, this is important to note because it identifies a singular origin for the narrative up to this point. To point back to the train illustration, everyone is at the same place. Diversification will now occur from this point. Now let's go on back to Genesis 10 for a moment. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And in Genesis 10 is the account of the descendants of the 3 sons. It is here that we are introduced to the primary character in the story of the Tower of Babel, Nimrod. Now, next week, we're going to look at what occurred at the tower. But for now, I want to concentrate on Nimrod himself. One of the sons of Ham was Cush. He was the father of Nimrod. In Genesis 10, 8 through 10, we read this. Now Cush fathered Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Now, there's a few things we learn from this passage, this portion of passage. Let's start with the name Nimrod. The etymology comes from the Hebrew marad, which means rebel. By adding an N before the M, it becomes the infinitive construct, Nimrod. The meaning then is the rebel. This name points to his rebellion. Even though he is Noah's great-grandson, his name points out that the rebellion that was center to his nature. The verse states that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, at first reading, this seems to be a complimentary statement, but instead, Hebrew commentators and writers point out that the phrase mighty hunter in connection with his name should be understood that Nimrod was the hunter who became a tyrant, a powerful hunter of men. Also, the part of the phrase that, in keeping with this, in the face of Yahweh, can only mean in defiance of Yahweh, as Josephus and the Targums understand it. What we get from all of this is a leader among men who captures men, who gathers them in order to build the cities and the kingdoms that are mentioned. One more thing. In Genesis 10:10, we see some of the cities that he established. Without getting too involved, the last city listed is Calneh, which means fortress of Anu. Anu is the Sumerian culture. In the Sumerian culture is a god, as you can see, and from him many other gods are derived. Once again, you see how from one source many others spring forth. Now, next week, we'll look more at this figure, but I wanted to introduce you to this leader among the people. He established cities and a name for himself. And like many others we find in history, his story became the thing of legends and myths. Monuments and statues are erected in his name and to his deeds. As a side note, Nimrod himself has been connected and suggested to be the famous Gilgamesh. But most certainly, the person Nimrod becomes deified as the chief god, as a chief god. Nimrod's Babylonian followers worshipped him as Marduk, the god of war and fortresses. Nimrod became the Roman god Bacchus, which means son of Cush. Bacchus was the god of wine and revelry. Marduk was also the Roman god Kronos, whose name means the horned one. Ancient artists have often depicted Nimrod wearing a crown of bull horns. Kronos is also the Roman god Saturn, who devoured his own sons as soon as they were born. The Phoenicians every year sacrificed their beloved and only begotten child to Kronos or Saturn, and the Rhodesians did often the same. Now, this brings us to the tales surrounding Nimrod. In separate writings comes the story of Nimrod and his wife, Semiramis. Without getting into too much of the details of the story, she too becomes deified as a goddess after the death of Nimrod. Subsequent legends arose which portray her as the mythic fertility goddess and mother of all gods. All attempts to trace the origins of goddess worship ultimately lead to one single woman in ancient history, Semiramis. She later became the fertility and queen goddess, Inanna, and is introduced with her son and husband Tammuz. After the dispersion of the Tower of Babel, they are worshipped she is worshipped as the fertility goddess and mother-son duo, which continued all throughout the ancient world. And the names changed in different locations due to the different languages, but Inanna Semiramis was known as Ishtar in Babylon, Isis in Egypt, and the sun husband was Osiris, the sun god. In Canaan, Tammuz became the sun god of the fire, Molech, to which Canaanite parents offered their firstborn to this god by placing their children in the outstretched hands of the large statue of Molech. She was worshipped as Venus in Rome and Aphrodite in Greece. She was also called Dianus, Artemis, the great fertility goddess of the Ephesians that we find mentioned in Acts 19:23 through 41. In the Old Testament, the name of this fertility goddess of the Canaanites was Ashtaroth, Baal's counterpart, mentioned in Judges 2:12, 3:7, 1 Kings 18:19, 2 Kings 21 and 7. She became a stumbling block for the Jews and their leaders for many generations. The prophet Jeremiah prophesied about the worship of this goddess in Jeremiah 44:19, where it says, and said the women, when we were burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, was it without our husbands and that we made for her sacrificial cakes in her image and poured out drink offerings to her? In Ezekiel 8:14 through 15, the prophet is shown by the Lord the worship of such gods in the very gates of the temple. It says, then he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. And he said to me, do you see this, son of man? Yet you will see even greater abominations than these. This passage goes on and continues with the Lord showing the prophet 25 men bowing toward the east, prostrated before the sun. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. The wicked and rebellious religions and gods that we see appearing throughout history and spread out across the globe have their source here in Babel. As the languages changed, so did the names of the false gods and the ideas associated with them. In time, details shifted and evolved until the links were thin and almost unidentifiable, but they all had one thing in common. They had left the connection to the one true God. What had begun as a family rescued from the disaster of the flood moved out and changed generation after generation. It reminds me of a game that perhaps many of us have played. You start with a circle of people. The first one whispers a message into the ear of the next person. Then in turn, they whisper it to the next person. And then the process continues until you get to the last person. What you discover is there is a shadow of the original message that might remain with some details covered to the end, but the true message has been distorted and changed. Now, apply this example to the matter of the beliefs of mankind. We have today an endless variety of religions and philosophies. Some may pay homage to a supreme being, but all of them have left behind the true and the living God revealed in the Scriptures. I remember years ago spending extended time researching this very topic and those related to it. And as I revisited this topic for this episode, I discovered that the list had only expanded. The enemy has rebranded and enlarged his enterprise. Our vocabulary is replete with it. We have New Age, we have mind sciences, words like avatar, chakras, yoga, meditations, auras, ideas and lifestyles that used to be hidden are now fully out and admired. We have satanic clubs and pride is celebrated. Nimrod would be proud. Of course, the real culprit isn't Nimrod. He was merely a man deceived by his own self in the hands of the original liar. The Bible warns us as it warned the people of ancient times. 1 Timothy 4:1 says it clearly. But the Spirit explicitly says that in the latter times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. I've told you before, the enemy has rebranded, but has not really changed his basic story or strategy. The ideas of Babylon will be alive until the very end. Revelation 17:3-4 tells us just as much. And he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, holding in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and the unclean things of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and abominations of the earth. We of all people should be aware and not be deceived. Not only is the source Babel, but the deepest deceiver was and is evil and demonic. The way we identify it is and always points somewhere other than the true and the living God. Have you ever wondered why today all ideas are tolerated except the true God and his Son Jesus? Every idea and sacred writing are revered except the Bible. Doesn't that tell us all we need to know? We live in a time where all ideas are viewed as equally valid and true. Some people accept this concept and think of themselves as open-minded and fair. But they forget that there exists an enemy who has been at work and to deceive and to destroy. His work is to distort truth by any means at his disposal. He has wicked intentions, hidden by borrowed ideals devoid of God. Know this: in the absence of truth, all ideas and lies are seduced by the liar. The sin of Babel was pride and idolatry. The scriptures are provided in order to warn us and to direct us to the truth. The same God that was sovereign at Babel is still sovereign today. Knowing the truth is the best defense that we have against the lie. Do you want to know how to distinguish the list of the enemy, the lies of the enemy? Know the truth. God has given us all we need. 2 Peter 1, 2, and 3 says it. Grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of our Lord Jesus, our Jesus our Lord, and his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. In these treacherous times, we can stand firm in the knowledge we have been given by our Lord. Even though many are being swept away in these times of deception, those who stand in his word have our feet planted firmly on the rock, which is our Lord. It's a reminder for us, once again, why truth matters.